Please, Elaine Walters, everybody. You're good?
So I think I'm all plugged in and you can hear me. God, I love this sound system in here. It doesn't matter where you sit, you can hear. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Do it again. So before I say too much more, I'm going to give you my agenda for this next hour and 15 minutes. And just know that this is not exactly the same as the workshop that I'm going to be doing this afternoon, if you're signed up for that. But one of the things, housekeeping-wise, I want you to know is that we're going to send you, I don't like how much paper and how many trees end up in the trash. And so I did not print handouts for you, physical handouts, but I will send you every single slide minus one that is not mine to share with you, so you don't have to take mad crazy notes. You'll have them. And so the way those will come to you is via email, and that will be true for this afternoon as well. So that's one thing. The other thing is, please just take care of your own physical bodies, your emotional selves as well. I am not going to share a lot of graphic details about trauma, but this is still a really tender topic. Many of us, in fact, we know in massage therapy and other healing arts practices, many more of us than in the general public have our own trauma histories that we come into the room with. Most of us have done significant healing work, or we wouldn't be sitting here on our own stuff, but that doesn't mean it doesn't get kicked and reminded and remembered in some funny places sometimes. So please take good care of yourselves. And for me, that means not sitting down and just staying seated. It may mean fiddling or drawing or doodling. I did not bring little fidget toys for you to play with this afternoon, but a lot of folks do when they're doing trauma-informed care trainings, and so the invitation, I will do other things to kind of break it up, but please do what you need to do to take care of yourselves, and I will not, in fact, I will actually be really pleased, so I won't take it negatively or personally if you spend a little time yawning. So in fact, just for a moment, put your hands on your heads. Lean your heads back and look at the ceiling and take a little yawn. One of the most misunderstood, natural, refreshing practices that our bodies know how to do from before birth is, I want you to reclaim that, okay? So that's that. So let me just do a little bit with my agenda. The thing I'm going to do a little bit of welcoming. We're going to do a little activity to start. I'm going to cover quickly and briefly prevalence and impact of trauma, and then we're going to talk about coping and healing, not coping versus healing, but I want you to know the differences. And then we're going to talk about your role as folks that are putting hands on people's bodies in supporting healing, but also what Mark said about really being able to think and have more competence around working with folks in our care that have experienced trauma. I really want to put you front and center. So your status, your competence, your comfort, your presence as sort of primary in being able to do anything following that could be useful to your clients. So I really want to move the focus on your state of being. And I'll do that a little bit this morning, and I will do it a lot this afternoon because it directly relates to our capacity to stay ethical and boundaried. And I'll say a lot more about that this afternoon. And then we'll do whatever time we have time for reflection, and then we're going to close, and then you all will go into a conversation with Ruth Warner about the research that's happening around pain science, correct? And around the connections to your work. Sound all right? So let's get started. What I'd like you to do is find a partner pair, because this isn't my workshop unless you talk to each other. Okay, so get in a pair, and I want to make sure, okay, so here's the rule about this. Here's the rule about this. I'm going to get my timer. I want you in equal pairs of two. So raise your hand if you don't have a partner, a partner. So who else doesn't have a partner? Okay, so can somebody partner with her? Thank you. All right, who else doesn't have a partner that wants to do this activity? Everybody's got a single partner, not a trio, but a partner. Good deal. All right, so here's the guidelines. Here's the guidelines. because there's guidelines to this, and we will do this a lot more in the afternoon because there's actually some really important benefits to doing this that are trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive benefits. And that is feeling connected to one another makes us think better and helps us feel more able to stay present. It actually requires social connection. How many of you spend most of your time one-on-one with people whose job it is you have to take care of in your work? How many of you occasionally notice that you're all by yourself with a big responsibility? Naked body, vulnerable person, possibly trauma survivor, somebody that may be triggered. That's a big deal. Raise your hand again and look around at each other because you're doing this a lot by yourself. So some of you count on these annual gatherings and trainings to kind of keep you connected to your folks, but that's not quite enough. Okay, and we'll talk more about that. But here's the guideline. So one of you is going to take a turn talking while the other one listens. Then you're going to switch, and I'm going to time it exactly equal. And there's a reason for the none of exactly equal rule. And that is that you have as much to give as you need, and you need as much as you have to give. And when we skew it so that one of us gets more and the other one gets less because you really need it more, or I really need it more, it actually is a miscommunication about humans. None of us have nothing to give. And none of us need more than one another. We become the more vulnerable person when we're receiving attention, and we may be rejecting of our co-person when we don't accept their affection, attention, warmth, interest, right? And so the equal matters. And so you can do this with lots of topics. The one I want you to spend a little time on today is just going to be about a minute and a half each. I want you to think about something that you have done in your practice recently that you know made a difference for the person you were working with. Some aha moment where you were especially aware that what you were doing in that moment was making a difference, a positive difference for the person you were working with. All right, now if that's too hard for you or you're distracted, you can also spend the first couple of seconds in your connection time telling the person, first tell your name no matter what, if you don't know each other. You may need to tell them what's distracting you. The kitty that you left that was sick, the person that you're not sure got to childcare okay, the situation with your landlord coming to your house today that you're out of control of. So if you're distracted, do a little bit of that first, but then if you can get to this piece of the conversation. That's why I'm going to give you a minute and a half. So you can probably understand pretty clearly why I want you to do the thing that's distracting you first if you can't get all the way here. So figure out while I set my timer who's going to go first. Then I'm going to say start. Oh, let me give you one more guideline. When you're the listener, when you are in the listener role, your job is not to stay mute or silent. Your job is actually to stay interested and focused on what's going on for that other person. And if your mind wanders into territory around, gosh, that reminds me of blah, 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 stop it, return. Stop it, return. So your face needs to also be a friendly, interested, curious face, not an empathetic or worried face. Don't do your worried face. Now, some of us live on a daily basis with our worried face on, so this is a slight stretch. So just notice the face you're offering to the person you're listening to. Keep it as neutral, interested, and curious as you can, which means you're not going to talk about the thing it reminded you of, but it also doesn't mean you have to be silent. So you can say, wow, or interesting, or do you want to say more? Okay, but it's about them, not about you, so you don't have to be silent. Go ahead.
Could you ask them questions?
Not out of curiosity, not because you want to hear the rest of the story, but because you think it might be helpful to guide them. So that means little, short, and sweet, which is the do you want to say more question, which is the, well, then what happened? That's about you. So do you see the difference? Do you want to say more about that? Or, gosh, please tell me the end of that story. I've got to know what happened. Okay, so it's about them. So do whatever, just use your own mind here. Relax, this is not a test. And then figure out who's going to go first. I'm going to literally set a timer. When it goes off, you're not going to hear it because you'll all be talking loudly. And I'm going to say, finish your sentences and then switch, so that your person gets equal time. Okay, and then I will notice whether that's a 10-second, 15-second break, and then I'm going to switch the timer on, and then I'll call time at the end of the second round. All right, so figure out who's going first. I'm setting the timer. And go ahead and start. Go ahead and start. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
All right, clap your hands once if you can hear my voice. Clap your hands twice if you can hear my voice. All right, thank you very much. So, how many of you found it slightly difficult to accept that kind of attention? Found yourself feeling a little shy? Anybody feel a little shy? All right, look around at your shy friends. Look around at your shy friends. All right. All right, people are going a little bit shy, but they're looking very shy when they're saying it. Okay, how many of you found it a little bit difficult not to think about your own stuff when your partner was talking? You know, not to sort of say, but I want to say something, or I really want to, right? Okay, raise your hands again, you people, we people, right? All right, so a couple of comments well, let me just ask you this. How many of you learned as practitioners this quality of listening? Somebody spent practice time teaching you and letting you practice that. So some of you, yeah, all right. Now, some of you may do it really intuitively, and some of you may also really understand how to listen to bodies that way, right? So it's that same quality of listening that we're talking about. How many of you get that quality of listening on a fairly regular basis? Now, I won't ask you to tell me how many of you pay for that. But what I will tell you is if you pay for it and if you're paying anybody to listen to you and you're not getting that quality where they actually are there to give your mind space without adding advice or opinions, you need to find somebody new. And if you've got somebody that does it like that really is there kind of backing up your own thinking without telling you what to think or how to think, they are worth it. They are worth every penny you pay for it. And some of us have that as peers and in our lives. And if you don't, there are ways to teach our people how to do that kind of listening so that we get it in our lives. But it is absolutely necessary that you have places where you can do that kind of practice in order to stay in this work. And I'll say a lot more again about that in this afternoon. Any quick comments about that activity, exercise? Mm-hmm. Well, and what you can't tell is that I added another half of a minute because people were still going. So you each got 2 minutes. So he's saying that he found it difficult to talk for that much time. Well, what's lovely is you don't have to, and I'm sorry I didn't say that, but silence and just noticing. So I didn't go too deeply into this because I didn't want to scare you too much. But the practice as the person being listened to is just as important as the listener, and it takes practice to use that kind of attention for our own benefit. And sometimes we aren't able to make eye contact. And the best we can do if we're making a step in this direction is to notice somebody's shoes pointed in our direction. Because the point is to notice that you've got somebody on your side. And a lot of us, when we were very little, weren't sure that was true. And that experience early in our lives is what a lot of us are still organized around. That's kind of what we're trying to unwind in our therapeutic practices, right? Is those disorganized ways of moving around in the world that are based on things that are not about present time, right? And so we got to keep doing that work in our own practices. So thank you. Yeah.
So we found it too short.
You found it too short. How anybody else felt like it was? Yeah, too short. Okay, so keep saying. Anything else you want to say about that? No, just that you found it too short. So how many of you felt like that was the really long 2 minutes? How many of you felt like it was long? How many of you felt like it was too short? You can work up. I wouldn't do this. I wouldn't do this more than an hour each direction. But, you know, they started cutting the sessions down in therapy to 50 minutes, and then they go to 45. It's like, no, 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 an hour of that is actually, you do stuff in that last half. How many of you have had the experience with somebody that you're working on, having what feel like breakthrough experiences or shifts in the way they're experiencing things in the last 5 minutes of the session you're doing with them? And it could feel like that's because it's almost over. And maybe sometimes it is. People know that they're going to get to run away shortly. And they're safer in that last little bit of intimacy time to do some of that work. But the other thing that is also true is that the longer span of time allows people to develop the foundational relationship stuff that needs to be in place session to session so that they can actually do that last bit of work. That is often the most profound work that happens in your session with them. So it takes time to get there, and it takes time to build the safety. And so an hour is not too much, but I wouldn't go past that. And you can start in 10-minute spots or 15-minute spots in this practice on a regular basis and get a lot of movement internally that you don't expect, actually. Okay? Thank you for doing that. The other thing is I just wanted you to feel more connected to each other in the room this morning, so that's why I wanted to do that. All right, so now we're going to launch into the presentation proper, okay? Oh, we did switch. You didn't get to switch. Oh, I yelled and switched, and did anybody else not get to switch? Who didn't get listened to? Oh my gosh.
I was listening to her. I didn't hear you.
Okay, sorry. She was listening so tightly and intensely that they didn't switch, and so
We'll do it afterwards.
So okay, you're fine, and I did say switch. So sorry about that. I should always yell because there's always a couple of you in a big room like this. But here's the thing, and I would really request that you follow through, and that is please, at break, take a turn with your other person so that it's an equal turn. Please do that if you can. Yes?
Except it's not that I heard you, however, he was continuing to talk. And he didn't hear you, and that's can happen.
That can happen too. So what we start doing is giving each other cues, and we just tap a little knee or tap on the table and say, I want to keep hearing you all day long, but it's time to switch. And if you don't, what'll happen is he'll feel bad because you didn't get your turn. Well, he should. Some of us have been trained up to be more attentive to how other people feel than them. No. And that's not always a good thing. I'm not saying that's a great thing. I'm just saying that some of us. So if you wouldn't mind at your break giving her attention and doing the rest. It's okay. Whether you think she needs it or not. That was so, now see, you see what happens, okay? And you see how I'm coaching around it. It's really important that people don't walk away. She will walk away feeling incomplete, and she won't know it. And I know. And should I not say what you're going to feel? I should not say what you're going to feel. She will maybe not feel anything. But in fact, you will not have had the experience both sides, and I'd like you to have that. Okay? And if you just can't stand it, make that agreement mutually between yourselves. Okay? Because you could always opt out of this anyway. So if you really don't like it, don't do it or don't want it. So, all right. So anything else? Thank you for telling me that. All right. So the fact is there are many ways sentient human beings can be hurt. And these hurts can happen earlier in life or anytime across the lifespan, but the earlier they are experienced, the more likely we are to have developed and organized around those experiences if we are not supported to resolve and heal them. We get hurt lots and lots and lots of different ways, and when we have opportunities to resolve and heal them because we have supported others and caregivers in our environment, there is no reason for us to carry anything forward, including hideous trauma. Human beings, and we are perfect examples of that, are living, walking, breathing examples of thriving people who have had lots of hard things happen to us. And I'll say a lot more about that this afternoon, but the reality is that we human beings are wired for healing, and we do it very nicely, and you folks help facilitate that, and you know it. So the ways we get hurt sometimes are complete accidents, and those can be extremely traumatizing accidents. I had a grandmother who was talking about witnessing her father's death when she was just 3 years old. She watched it around the corner. He died of tuberculosis. It's not a pretty sight. It's actually a very violent death. And I am certain, I would bet my life on the fact that people either did not know she was standing there or did not know it would hurt her, and that she would carry that with her till she was dying. When she was in her mid-80s, she was still talking about what she saw when she was 3 years old. Now, I didn't know then what I know now about the benefit to her of staying neutral, open, flexible, and letting her tell me that story. I was a young person and I hadn't been trained, and so I was scared to let her go there. But she was desperate to have somebody listen to what happened to her, even 80 years later. Okay, accident, total accident. Abuse is that intentional, perpetuating, often getting worse over time, kind of person-to-person stuff that we do to each other, often in intimate relationships, most often in intimate relationships, that can leave people very confused, very, very impacted. Now, we can also inherit traumatic experiences from our people. When it's one-to-one-to-one, we inherit our parents' stuff, right? Or the nearest community members. When it's larger stuff, it can be oppression. So, for example, how many of you have people that went through the Great Depression in the United States? How many of you can call out a few behaviors that you witnessed or know about that your people continued to do long after the Depression was over? Just call them out.
Basically,
one at a time.
Bending celery and carrots, or just keeping food longer, even though it's gone bad.
Yep, perfect.
Stockpiling food.
Stockpiling food.
Saving everything.
Saving everything.
Reusing a tea bag.
Reusing a tea bag 10 times.
Portioning out all meals.
Portioning out all meals.
Rage over tiny expenditures.
Rage over tiny expenditures.
Empty your plate.
Empty your plate. You never leave the table with a plate with still food on it.
Saving money.
Saving money. Where? Hiding money.
In the bed.
Where did your people hide their money? In the bed, in the mattress? In the can out back, in the Bible, in the underwear drawer, under the boards, in the backyard. How many of you had the pleasure or the pain, or heard about the pleasure of the pain or of clearing out somebody's stuff after they died? All right, so you know these stories, right? These stories are, okay, so other things that people talked about, reusing, recycling, never throwing anything away. You could buy the thing brand new for 1/10 of what it costs you to repair it, and they repair it, right? Now, if you think about those things just content-wise, that's smart. The planet would be a much better place if we reused and didn't waste food and recycled and saved our money and were frugal and careful and thoughtful about everything we brought home and had a stash of cash and had a stash of food and had buckets of water under the house in case the power goes out and we could survive. So sometimes people use the word hoarding, but this is not hoarding. This is stockpiling. Right? It is different than hoarding. Hoarding comes after a big, serious loss and a lot of emotional upset. This kind of stockpiling comes after deprivation, when people went hungry, right? So there were reasons for these things, but the things themselves, if just taken one at a time, they're just smart behavior, right? This is intelligence at work. We could learn a lot from this. So what is the problem? Why am I calling it inherited trauma? Because of the rage, the upset, the tension, the stress, the panic, the terror that our people carried with them long after the fear and danger was over. That's traumatic response and traumatic reaction long after the trauma has passed. And so not only did our people suffer, we suffered under them. We weren't allowed to leave the table. We got forks in our backs of our hand. We were chastised. We were belittled. We were treated badly. We were abused. We were put in our room. We were raged at. We were screamed at. We were hit and hurt, or our parents were, because not only did they pass down the thinking behaviors that they'd come up with, they passed down the emotional upset that they had never resolved and worked out. And I won't ask you to raise your hands to this, but some of us continue to carry the patterns that were passed down to us. We panic when we don't have cash in the drawer. We panic when we don't have stockpiles. We panic about food. We have incredible eating struggles in this country, partly because intergenerational famine is in many of our histories, and it works all different ways. We do not know how to eat consciously, thoughtfully, flexibly, outside of distress, most of us, whether you can see it on our bodies or not. Right? That is inherited, conditioned trauma that we continue to carry. Now, the flip of that is pretty beautiful, and that is I can actually do healing work that cleans up my grandmother's trauma. I can actually process the degree to which it's impacting my life and where that comes from with enormous connection to the grief and pain of what happened to her, because it's in my body. I am carrying that in my upsets, in my anxiety, in my distresses. And when I do healing work, I'm actually cleaning up intergenerational trauma that will then not get passed down to my grandchildren. That's kind of powerful. That the bodies that you're working with, the beings that you're working with, carry 55,000 generations of matings to get each one of us here. Isn't that phenomenal? 55,000 people had to mate, birth children that they kept alive in the face of incredible odds to then reproduce and birth and carry on. 55,000 times it took to get you here. And that means we are carrying collectively and individually all of that with us. And it's very resolvable. It's very resolvable. And lots has already been done in this direction. Oppression is an extension of this. Oppression is the way we treat each other systematically that is rooted in this passed down crap. We did not get born, everybody says nobody was born a racist. Well, we were born into homes that had the conditions in place so that we were going to get programmed to carry racism, either as people targeted for it and it being internalized in our people, or as people who were set up to perpetuate it and act it out. And that is inherited. That is inherited internal systems that come from the environments we were born into. And just like I have clear evidence that we can clean up individual intrafamilial trauma, we can also do our work on how we learned racism and sexism and adultism and homophobia. We can actually look at our own personal stories of being trained up in these ways of being and work on them directly. And it'll make a hell of a difference in your lives personally, and it will change the face of oppression. It actually does clean up intergenerational stuff. So this is my case for why you matter and what you can do with the precious, important life you've been given. And it isn't about what you do for other people. It turns out to be that in the best possible sense of the word, but it's actually about yourself. Does that make sense? So definition of trauma. I am not going to use a clinical definition of trauma. I'm going to use a human definition of trauma that comes from a woman that happens to do clinical work, but she's a very radical therapist out of Canada who really is trying to give the thinking and understanding of trauma to us in our communities and to get it out of the hands of mental health professionals. This idea that we hand over expertise about things that we know more about than the experts do is what she's challenging, okay? And she's also challenging some of the definitions of post-traumatic stress that were early on in this world, what she says and what we at the Trauma Healing Project have sort of taken on as our own way of thinking about that is that trauma is not a disorder, but a reaction to a kind of wound. It is a reaction to profoundly injurious events and situations in the real world, and indeed to a world in which people are routinely wounded. I want to tell you that it's a pet peeve of mine that we're talking about trauma left and right, and that the term is sort of bantied around to mean I didn't get the cookie of my choice, or I didn't get that thing that I wanted, or you said something that bugged me. We're using that term sort of very flippantly in a similar way to the way we use the term Nazi now. You're a hall Nazi, you're a feminazi, you're a kitchen Nazi, you're a language Nazi, you're a grammar Nazi, you're a clothing Nazi, you're a, right? Though you've heard these, right? There's something really important about that process. It minimizes and normalizes behavior that is so extraordinary and so damaging. So it takes the sting out of it, which is the point of it, because facing it is really painful. But the choice to not face it is a choice to continue some of the patterns that we carry around it. And it also dismisses and invalidates the reality that people experienced. All of our people experienced what happened in Nazi Germany in one way or another in that time period. Wherever we sit in this picture, we are all impacted by it. And so mouthing off about trauma is the same thing. I am talking about big T trauma. I am talking about profoundly injurious events and situations in the real world that happen at epidemic levels. So even though I'm talking about big T trauma, I'm talking about abuse and violence or horrific, life-threatening and life-altering experiences, they happen a lot. And this is hard to face. And it's real that we have to face it. Okay, so I'm just giving you that's my little soapbox for the day. So trauma is maybe one of a couple. Trauma is a concrete physical, cognitive, affective, and spiritual response by both individuals and whole communities to events and situations that are objectively traumatizing. So this is another point that she makes over and over and over again. We're not talking about people's subjective or people's biology that makes them more vulnerable, or people's sensitivity or mental illness. We're actually talking about things that are objectively traumatizing. And we'll talk more later about the difference between, the difference between somebody who's experienced a similar trauma and looks good 10 years later compared to somebody that is really struggling for the rest of their life because of something that was very similar. What's the difference? It can seem like the difference is the problem in that person, and it's not. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But these are really things that are objectively traumatizing. And on a simple level, for the most part, people feel traumatized or wounded because they have been wounded, even if we don't have direct memory of what happened to us. If it feels like it, if you act like it, if you respond like it, if you think you have, there's a pretty good shot that you have, and most of us don't escape. The numbers I'll share with you are pretty staggering in a way, but that's our definition of trauma, and that's one that you're free to use. So I like the trauma framework because it actually brings together things that are often seen as very separate. So it actually connects us to each other and to this work. So for example, the mental health system is seen as separate, then the correction system is seen as separate from the child welfare system, is separate from complementary medicine, is separate from, so all of those sort of ways we talk about problems that people have their own special shape and size, and also their solution, which are sometimes contradicting, right? Aren't you? How often do you find yourself contradicting what Western medicine tells people they need to do, right? And so understanding trauma, having a trauma lens actually bring you language and a way to think about the connections that are overarching. And it's a common language that can be really helpful to people. So for us, it's been really useful to have a trauma framework. But I want to tell you what's more exciting to me is really understanding healing. That what is really powerful is that there seem to be some universal healing opportunities in every human being and body that exists. That there are some tendencies and trajectories that when given a chance, every single human being I know of will take. I think that's pretty powerful. And I think you got your finger on some of those literal pulses in the work that you're doing. So the other thing that's really important about this is to understand and to make the shift around, and this is in our language too. And somebody said yesterday, that we tend to focus, I think it was it Whitney was talking about this, where we put our hands on somebody's shoulder and we immediately go for, gosh, that's the tight, oh man, you're tight, right? And that can feel like something's wrong with them. And I think what we really can start doing more and more in our practice and in our lives is asking the question, what's going on? I mean, they really are tight. It's probably not the tightest person you've ever put your hands on, so don't say that. But you can notice that somebody has a hitch in their motion, or a place where they seem to be holding, or physical sensations of hot and cold going on. It is all right to notice it, but the way you're noticing it is as a point of listening, as a point of guidance, rather than your mind going to, oh, this is what's wrong. This is why you know, it's really more of an inquiry. And that's the shift. It's really more of a question of what happened or what's happening instead of what's wrong. Does that make sense? And it's a subtle shift, but it will change the way you work if you get there. And so what that lets us do is, instead of talking about illness and deficit, and thinking about trauma as a subjective experience, it's actually incorrect to say that one person's trauma is another person's irritation. It's never true. The objectively traumatizing event is an objectively traumatizing event, and the way it wears in a body may be different, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But in fact, we're really not talking about the person so much as really how to get in there with them. And so it's not an illness deficit model then, it's really an understanding and support model that we can wrap our minds around more effectively. And then lastly, and I won't say this more than 10 more times, that it demands our own healing. It's not just a cheeky thing to say that you will never take your clients further than you're willing to go yourself. It's just a fact. And you don't know it unless you do the work, how incredibly joyful and it is to recover parts of yourself that have gotten lost back there because of trauma. And even the practice of healing, when it's done well, is not drudgery. It is not talk therapy. It is not belaboring the story. It includes touch and dance and laughing and movement, and absolutely crying and raging are part of it, but you don't get left there. You are with company now, returning to recover the lost parts of yourself, and there is absolute joy. So we kind of tend to flatline, and United States culture is really focused on flatlining so that we don't feel pain. There is an enormous focus. I actually will ask you this a little bit facetiously. What is the problem with pain? And I actually want you to think about that. What is the problem with pain? Why are we so intensely avoidant of pain that we spend billions upon billions of dollars attending to repressing pain? And we do that in the straight pharmaceutical market, and we do it in the underworld where lots of us inhabit, right? All the things we do to not feel. The issue partly is that it doesn't get us anywhere. It actually gets us addicted and confused and sort of stuck. And that when you flatline the pain, you also flatline the joy. And so your range of life gets pretty narrow. And what gets called in somatic experiencing, which is a whole different conversation, sort of a zone of tolerance, my goal is actually to increase your zone of tolerance, not to just work inside of it, but to actually expand it so that you build in your own selves a capacity to tolerate extreme emotional experiences so that you aren't freaked out by them in your own self, and you won't be freaked out by them when you've got somebody that is willing to show them to you in your practice. So I want you to increase your range of tolerance and your competency and your capacity around emotional intelligence, but also around emotional experience, okay? And that's the demand around your own healing. So how many of you know about the Adverse Childhood Experiences study? Raise your hands high, please, because this is the most important social science research that's been done in any of our lifetimes, and it directly relates to your work. And this is not a chastisement or a scolding, it's an invitation. Now, the reason the Adverse Childhood, let me tell you what it is first. The Adverse Childhood Experiences study was done in San Diego County in 1998. It's getting old now, 1998, 1999. And it did not prove anything we didn't already know. You already know this, you know it in your bones, that if you treat children badly and you expose them to difficult environments, they don't do as well when they grow up. We don't do as well when we grow up and we're hurt in childhood. We know that. How many of you studied early childhood education or early childhood in some way, development? So lots of you. So this is not news. What's so important and what makes this study so important is that it was done in a way that you cannot refute. They asked a simple set of questions. They weren't written this way exactly. There was a guy who was a doctor, is a doctor, who was working with folks around weight loss. And so he was working with people that were what were called, that were really struggling for health-related reasons with their weight. And so they were doing these support groups. And they had this uncanny repetition of experiences that included people getting very close to their goal weights and dropping out, or regaining not just the amount they had lost, but more back within pretty short order. Now, they weren't 100%. And I will just tell you around eating stuff, the same thing I said before. This is one way we show struggles around eating. And I'm a person who gets underweight for reasons of neglect. So we all carry stuff in our bodies. There's not like any shame in how it looks. It's just reality, and that kind of gives us an access point, right? So this doctor was very curious about this, and so he was listening to his patients. They were medical patients in this program. He was asking them what was going on for them. And these 10 experiences came up over and over and over in their background. These are the 10 things that are identified in this study. They are not the only things that would constitute adversity in childhood. I would add to this exposure to war. I would add to this community level violence, where you witness homicide or violence on your streets. I would also add to this institutional violence and immigration or refugee related violence that happens, okay? So there are other things you could add as well. People want to put poverty up here, although poverty doesn't have to be violent or traumatic to people. But these are the 10. Let's pretend these 10 are the ones. These are the 10 they studied. They were the ones that were correlated with this group of people, and they surveyed 17,000 plus people in San Diego County, mostly white, all had health insurance before the Affordable Care Act. So this is not necessarily the group that we're all part of, but for the sake of it, that's who they had. And here's the clincher. They had access to every single one of their medical records. That's the clincher. So what they could do, because they were the insurance company that funded the study, is they could correlate the degree to which these adversities related to later health outcomes, and they could make a direct link. All right, so here's the way this works, and you can look at this. If you have one of these on the list before you were 18, then you have an ACE score of 1. If you have 3 of them, you have an ACE score of 3. If you have 5 of them, you have an ACE score of 5. So take a peek, count it up for yourselves. All right? Don't have to share this, I just want you to notice it. Now, before I move on to telling you what the impact and the risks are health-wise related to this, I want you to know that this is not a definite sentence. Those of us who've done our own healing work and who've tended to this or gotten support around it do not have the same risk factors as those of us who are still really struggling with it. But for those of us that haven't gotten healing attention around our adversity, let me just show you some prevalence rates. So look at just the prevalence rate. This is mostly middle class, mostly white, mostly educated. The average age, I think, was 51. And so those are pretty staggering numbers, especially when you think that about 68% of this population had at least one, right? And if you had one, you were much more likely to have 2. Now, don't make the mistake to think, oh my gosh, if there was this many in this fairly privileged, affluent group of folks, what does that mean about my community? Or what does that mean about your community? Be careful with that, because what we have found is that you can't make that jump. There are communities that face extreme adversity because of their circumstance in this country and in our towns that do not have domestic violence, that do not have sexual abuse, that do not have that stuff happening in their families because they have other resiliency and pieces in place. So don't assume that because somebody is more disadvantaged or because you think of them that way, that they have more ACEs than you do or than somebody else might. So don't make that leap. The point all the way through this presentation is you stay open, curious, and thoughtful, as if anybody could have adversity in their lives that continues to affect their health. That's called universal and human-centered design. You organize yourself around maybe never knowing, but always acting as if. Okay, so the numbers are high. In Oregon, we have a behavioral survey. It's called the, I can't remember, Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey that Oregon does every couple of years. And so these are the numbers for Oregon. Lots of us have household substance abuse. These are not the same numbers as the San Diego County. You'll notice they're different. So these are in order of occurrence. Household substance abuse, verbal abuse, parental separation or divorce, physical abuse, household verbal mental illness in the house, violent treatment of a mother. And they didn't do violence against the men in the household because this was just a category of things that were related to that group of people that they drew from. Right, so these were the common things. Sexual abuse at 13%, and then incarceration. And actually, in Oregon, that's double what it was in San Diego, the incarceration rate. So living with somebody that's been incarcerated in your family. So those are Oregon numbers.
Those are 8 of them,
8%.
no, I mean, those are 8 categories.
Yeah, that's just 8. These are the top ones. Yeah, these are not all of them. So. Yep, so that's where they come in Oregon. So that's us, right? And some of us are getting concentrations of people with adverse childhood experiences, and some of us are don't think we're seeing anybody with them. And if we're not asking and we're not paying attention, we may not know. So, and then in Oregon, the 0 is the 38%, and then the 1 ACE, you can kind of see, some of us, 9%, the big number I want you to notice is the 9 and the 7% that have had 4 or 5 or more ACEs. That's 17%. Just about 17% of Oregonians have had high levels of exposure. That is a lot of us. That is a lot of us. And here's a picture of why it matters. So I want to, where did my pretty pictures go? Hang on. I lost something that I wanted to share with you. Hang on. Let me just get to these. Okay. They're just a little out of order. Hang on. So here's where the reality hits. And these are, again, risk factors, not for sure's, okay? So you can start seeing the ones on the right side are when there are 4 or more. Ischemic heart disease, stroke, COPD, diabetes, and sexually transmitted diseases. All completely correlated with how many adversities we had in childhood. Now, some of those are behavioral. You know, some may be smoking related or some may be behavioral, sexual behavior related. So the other number that happens for folks that have had a lot of sexual abuse is that there's a lot of extra sex that's happening that is not by choice sex. So it's either sort of overindulgence, sort of compulsive sexual behavior, or being victimized, or victimizing people who've had that in their heritage. So the likelihood of getting a sexually transmitted disease. The other thing that goes along with STDs is a heavy neglect. Those of us that were not attached and neglected in early childhood also have a much higher risk of difficulty around self-care and self-protection. So the choice to use protection during sexual intercourse has everything to do with us feeling like we have a right to. And if we've been abused sexually or we've been battered or emotionally impacted, we may not be able to make that choice for ourselves. And so those risk factors go way up. Okay? So here's another one. We talk about mental health in this country like it's a biological, genetically predisposed set of problems that we have, and we treat it with medication as if there's a gap in our brain function that needs to be corrected by medication. That's the whole mental health system right now, right? isn't it? It's all over the news. It's all over the TV. You can get a drug to help you with anything.
Medicating, the thought that kind of comes to me is more, we've got the addiction where we're medicating ourselves, but medicating the right to feel. And one of the things I was talking to this gentleman about is the chakra system, basically. Judith, Judith, basically just the structure of, feeling safe is first, and the right to feel and the emotion. And so what I'm hearing, and I'm putting it together to Eastern and Western, it's pretty fascinating. We're being shut down and not vulnerable and not able to express ourselves.
Well, and for good reason, because we don't really have a place to go with it. We don't have competency around us sort of inviting us to show our feelings. So there's really like this double-edged thing, and those of us that show too much of our feelings are ending up locked up. So the thing is just kept in place, and I'm not actually trying to criticize the mental health system so much as to say it's very limited and it's in this box. And so let me just do a quick time. I don't know what time we started. So I don't know how much more time I have. Mark, do you know?
You're about an hour in now, but
Okay.
roll for another 20 or...
Perfect. Okay. So I want you to look at this. Let's imagine that 0 really is 0 and that people didn't have adversity in their lives. Let's just pretend like that's true. Those 10 are 10, right? That only explains about 16% of mood disorders, 22% of anxiety disorders, 7 or 8% of substance abuse, and impulse control disorders are for people that didn't have adversity. Every other bit of those realities is rooted in early childhood adversity and options in our household for how we deal with those adversities. And so I think the fact that we're still talking about substance use disorder as a disorder that is biologically based in genetic predisposition is we are losing it. I don't know if you know what the success rates are for treating anybody kind of getting out of these disorders. Do you know what it is? They're very extremely low, and mostly when we get diagnosed with any of them, we are seen to have them permanently. The fact that there is disorder at the end of it means, and if you've ever had a label of a disorder and tried to get it off of your record so that you could become a cop or a child care provider or a teacher in a special ed school, you will know what it's like to try to get this off your record. It is seen as a permanent experience that you will always have. That's pretty deflating, isn't it? It can be also very much a relief when you have somebody that can tell you kind of what's wrong with you so that you can try to do a treatment that will help fix you or make you better, at least stable. But it misses the boat on healing and recovery by a long shot. Okay, so that's the point of this. And so I'm going to back up into these. So people who have experienced trauma are also 4 times more likely to become alcoholic, 4 times more likely to develop the sexually transmitted disease, 4 times more likely to inject drugs, 3 times more likely to be on medication, 3 times more likely to be absent for work, 15 times more likely to commit suicide. So here's the reverse of this. Not all of us who've had lots of trauma experience any of these things or struggle or are challenged with any of these things. Lots of us have found other ways to cope, some of them really good for us, some of them not so good for us. Some of us have had the blessing and support to heal and recover completely, and we are walking examples of that possibility. But if you are working with people that have struggled with any of these things, you are working with people who have histories of trauma. So while we don't all inject drugs, if you are working with somebody that has ever injected drugs, you are dealing with somebody that has a significant history of trauma. We find almost 0 people willing to inject drugs without a history of adversity.
What's the age group on that study?
So this is lifetime experiences of outcomes, but the age of those experiences is 0 to 18. Does that make sense? He asked what was the age that we're talking about. So this is lifetime prevalence of the struggles, but childhood-based adversity that's connected to it. So when trauma happens, we often think of this fight or flight, and I actually want you to think about putting that in a different order. It's really important to me that you put it in a different order. Those of us who were too little or too backed into a corner or too overwhelmed to fight back feel bad enough without thinking that we did something wrong because we didn't fight. When in fact our biology is wired in a completely different survival-driven order. The first order of events when we are under threat is to look very much like the deer we criticize who stops in the headlights. That is a very smart practice of environmental scanning and assessment. Do you notice the deer is not shut down? Their ears are going like this. If you notice what's actually happening, they can't see because there is headlight in their eyes, but what they can do is smell, listen, assess. That is what we are designed to do, and it happens split second. If a threat is assessed, and we'll talk a bit more about this afternoon, the gut is the first information sharer that there is a threat, and then the mind has to sort with the support of the gut whether it's an actual danger. If there's an actual danger, then the next thing we do is we get the hell away from it. But we're talking about babies sometimes, right? We're talking about us as babies. We're talking about little people, and we're talking about big people in situations where we don't have control. So there are many times when we cannot get away. There's no possibility we can get away. If we are positioned correctly, we will fight. As a next resort. That will be, our bodies start moving. Our whole chemical system moves into adrenaline-supported, cognitive function blocking reactions to survive that make us super strong, super powerful, and super scared. All right, that's how that works. And if we cannot get away, then we have to do something different. And if we cannot get away and we cannot fight, then the something different we do is we survive in our minds. That freezing process is intelligent, really elegant, and keeps us alive by actually allowing us to disconnect and go into a different part of our minds for protection. It is brilliant. Now, not all of us could do that. Has everything to do with the situation and the developmental stage we're at the age and time things happen to us. But if we were blessed with that capacity to dissociate and to disconnect and to go into a separate place in our mind, most evidence is beginning to show that it is actually a physical brain protectant, that there are parts of the brain mechanism that get preserved in the ability to shut down.
So I have a question about that. I've read that when a child is under the age of 5, it's theta. They're in more theta waves, so they can't block out stuff. So how would that correlate for under 5 to be able to disassociate? Better or worse, or don't know?
I don't know enough about that.
Okay.
What I know is that many of us can tell you we learn to dissociate at much younger than 5 ages. And you know it. I mean, and you see people. In fact, when they start unincluding memories of the first time they started dissociating, it was often in infancy. In fact, that's the place where we are the most likely to develop that capacity. And it's also, when it comes earlier, it's also the hardest to undo it, to sort of come out of that practice. But, so I'd love to see that research. Because that's not the experience of most of the people that I talk to that have this capacity. And so I want to give you a little picture of what we do. So given the way we respond kind of leans these two directions: overactivation, hypervigilance, or shutdown. And some of us do both, depending on what kinds of experiences we had, because what we're talking about when we do these things that become habitual and built into our wiring system and our functioning is we've been under chronic threat. It's not usually a one-time experience. It's been those things happening over and over and in environments that didn't protect or help us resolve, right? And so when we've experienced this chronic threat and chronic trauma, we end up with something that's called and referred to as complex trauma. And there's books on this. You can find lots about this. But what you will see in people, all of us have a tendency to kind of lean one direction or another. Some of us shut down. Some of us overamp. All right? And so they are actually physiological systems that you can respond to as in your clinical practice. You can notice whether your person is disappearing while they're on your table or whether they're getting agitated. And you will have an idea about what's going on for them. And in both cases, your job is to kind of move back to center, which is present moment, which often means for the overamped person, sort of slowing down, right? Or matching them. You know, you can play with this, but it means you stay present and notice what's going on. And so we tend to either overamp, and that switch is really, that is our fight back or get away. That is our adrenaline run, cortisone flushed state of being. And we can get addicted to it. It can be what we do in any sort of moment, whether it's stressful or reminds us of stressful. We are the people that go from 0 to 60 and seem way out of balance with what's actually happening in our face. And it's automatic. It's a system that kicks on automatically. Or we dissociate, and that's automatic too. And those can be sort of moderate, minimal. All of us are familiar with some level of these, or they can be extreme states. And they can be surprising to you as a clinician, and they can be very surprising to the people you're working on, because sometimes people will kick into a state they don't know they do, where you're paying attention to them and you're noticing it, brings it to their awareness. But you're noticing it is really important. The fundamental injury, the fundamental response in both cases, along that whole continuum, is disconnection. Somebody is not here. So if you think of hypervigilance as sort of like a fibrillating heart, it's pumping like triple time, but there ain't no blood moving, right? The blood is no longer moving because we're overamped. It's the same thing. The brain is no longer kind of functioning at a pace that it allows us to be here presently or to be with you. Same thing with disconnection. It flatlines. And you can actually do brainwave studies now with people who have the capacity to dissociate. You stress them out and you can watch their brain actually shut down in brain imaging. It flatlines. Primal brain even gets subdued. Okay, so again, there's tons of stuff you can and should be reading and learning about this. So the survival response we see becomes very rigid and patterned. But the main purpose of this slide is, and these kind of come along that continuum in one way or another, or have an effect on it, is that we make sense. Our reactive systems, our programming, our conditioning make complete sense. Whether you understand it or not, there is always a story. And what you can do with that knowledge is really important. This is trauma-sensitive care, is you remembering, always keeping in mind that there is a story that explains this. And from the most bizarre presentations you think you've ever seen to the simplest ones, from somebody who plucks out their eyebrows or twirls their hair, to people who we do all kinds of things that don't look like they make sense in the moment. But if you know the beginning of that pattern and that ritual and that response, you will see that it makes absolute sense. And what that means is that you can always approach your sessions with people with curiosity. And that is true for the good things too, right? So our good patterns also have a story. But there's always a story, and you don't have to get the story. In fact, for most of you, it's not your job to get the story. Your job is to notice the story that the body is already telling you and that the person is already telling you and respond appropriately, and to stay present and to remember that there is a story. This is true. This is so important. If you think about the way many of our treatment programs and our family systems work, there's a lot of shame and blame and a lot of judgment. That misses the fact that there's a story that makes sense of this. And I'll tell you what, if I am being addictive or compulsive and you approach me with, and I'm sure there's a reason for this and it probably saved your life at some point and makes a lot of sense, my interest in the treatment you're going to offer me is far and away above the treatment programs that already make me feel bad, or the community members that already make me feel bad because I struggle with an addiction. And I'm much more likely to be successful in the process of healing if that's what's coming at me. So this is one of the most important points I want to make. Every single one of these very predictable, understandable reactions to trauma makes sense if you know where they come from. The substance abuse, the addiction, the depression and numbness, including violence and aggression. And we're going to talk a bit about this afternoon. You know, one of the confusions that we have right now about sexual assault and sexually offending behavior is that there are evil people perpetrating them, which is what we kind of want to think, right? Because then it could never be us. It's just those evil people. And we have got, if we really want to stop it, I'm not talking about excusing it, but if we really want to stop it, we have got to understand the story behind it. And we've got to focus on correcting the story for ourselves, because we're on a continuum where we can all be impacted or participating. Right? We can't demonize people and stay on this understanding and actually change what's happening. So I don't know if I have as much time as I want to tell you this, but I want you to have these slides, and you'll have these slides. There is every reason to understand and to study the correlation between chronic pain and trauma, and very specific kinds of health struggles and trauma, and it goes really both ways. If you have a trauma history, you're much more likely to have chronic pain, and if you have chronic pain, you're much more likely to have a trauma history. This is a two-directional thing. It's not completely causal, because some of us get out of it when we heal, but it's there, and it cannot be ignored or dismissed or medicated away. And we're in deep trouble around this stuff. And again, I will ask you to think about, what's the problem with pain? What's the problem with pain? Really reflect on that in your own practice, in your own lives, because this question has got to be a conversation. The consequences of trauma are emotional, physical, developmental, social, individual, intergenerational, and collective. We are deeply impacted by the fact that people are cruel and harmful to one another, whether we are directly targeted, whether we are helping people resolve the consequences of it, or whether we're perpetuating or participating in it. We are all, there's nobody free of this. Our whole worlds are actually organized around the fear of potential harm, past experiences of potential harm. Think about guns, military, jails, non-voluntary, involuntary mental health. Think about what you do on a daily basis to keep yourself from being assaulted, where you park, where you go, who you hang out with, who you feel like you can have as your friends. You will see very directly in your personal lives and in society that we are absolutely organized around avoidance or experiences of trauma. We are a trauma-organized culture. And it works very well to keep capitalism floating in a particular way, but it's not good for anybody. It's not good for anybody. And so these consequences impact us in a very personal way, and in a very professional way. And our efforts need to be holistic in the way we address and understand them. So this is where you come in. So I want to just give you just a quick overview. Many of you raised your hands and said you had sort of child development training or have worked with little children and you have some knowledge about this. But there are some things we get in childhood, if we're lucky, that have to do with practices of our caregivers and the interaction between us and our caregivers as little bitties that allow us to develop capacities as adults. And so what we get from our people is connection, space to try things and freedom, empathy, somebody being attentive to us, and having attention that's about us in that little listening pair that we did. That's somebody practicing having a certain kind of attention that is really about what's going on for you. And if you think, how many of you are parents? How many of you struggled with any of these with your kiddos? Right? And so I think, thankfully, there's people that are really trying to back us up here as parents who struggle with this, because we were parented in ways that completely influenced our way to parent, our capacity to parent our children, right? And most of us did better in lots of ways than our parents did with us, right? But the fact is, that so some of the research around attachment, for example, suggests that if your kid gets it or you get it, somewhere between 25 and 30% of the time, you're going to be okay. So the fact that you struggle 70% of the time isn't going to completely screw up your kid. Doesn't mean you shouldn't put money in their therapy and their college fund. Every time my daughter would tell me or my son would tell me something that I'd done to really screw him up, I'd say, oh my God, we better put another quarter in the therapy jar. And when my daughter was about 17, she came up to me completely out of the blue and she said, Mom, you know that jar? She said, it's got to have like thousands of dollars in it by now. Can I have it? And I said, I will pay for your therapy. You know, that was the best I could figure out to do. And it made a difference for her, but she wanted the money. So if we have people that can connect with us, we learn attachment. If we have attachment, we learn the capacity to connect with others as an adult. If we have folks that support our self-efficacy and exploring and allow us freedom, then we actually have efficacy and capacity for that in our own lives. Same with attunement and same with, really importantly, emotional regulation. If we got people around us that could emotionally regulate themselves, then we learned to self-soothe. And if we didn't, we have gaps. And we know who we are. We know who we are. And we know where we struggle and where our gaps are. Because really, again, this culture, U.S. culture in particular, is not set up for child rearing. It's set up for production. We are a capitalist, industrialized society who raises up babies to go to work. That is very different than being organized around reaching our fullest potential. Right? Just without criticizing, it's just a fact, right? So we aren't set up in good shape to raise little ones to have capacities, especially if we didn't get them ourselves. So what that means is our role as caregivers takes a particular light. We know, for those of us that struggle, where we can and can't go that's going to knock us off our game, right? I know that there are certain situations where I have no capacity to self-regulate, none, zero. And so I go to places where I know I can stay self-regulated or where other people will help me be regulated. So a mindfulness class, a meditation class, a yoga class, a particular way of learning and talking with other people, right? I know where I get that. Well, even in relationships with people that have had all of this and are able to, we can get knocked off our game because of hard situations, right? I may be a person who's very attached, able to attune, really able to self-regulate, but my mom just died. And that throws a whole different picture into it. So healthy human interactions really facilitate, both in childhood, we get it, but there's some really interesting research around attachment, and it's really mind-blowing. You can do a little test with 12-month-old babies where you can test the attachment style of the baby. And it's called a stranger, there's a name for it. I'm not going to remember it. It's like a stranger experiment. And so what they did is they did several different situations where the parent walked away. No, the child was playing independently, and the parent left the room and then came back. And then the parent left the room and a stranger came in, and then the parent came back. And so there were like several different scenarios that they did with the baby, and they could tell by watching the baby's reaction what level of attachment and what kind of attachment style it had. You know, was it secure? Was it insecure avoidant? Was it insecure anxious? Or was it unattached and completely insecure, right? So you could tell very accurately. Not only could you tell very accurately the attachment going on for the baby, you could predict accurately what their attachment style with their own children would be when they became parents.
Is it strange situation experiment?
Yeah, yeah. strange situation experience. So it's very, and so there's an adult inventory that you can take around your own attachment style as an adult that is completely tied up in what the attachment capacity of your parents. So it's a circle. Now, thankfully, we can actually intervene in that circle and we can change things so that you could have had very insecure attachment as a little one, and you can practice and learn how to securely attach with your children. So this is not also written in stone how it goes, but it's very correlated. And so interactions with caregivers allow the child's brain to develop, actually physically, physiologically, neurologically develop, to move from this somebody else is regulating me to me being able to regulate myself, right? And without them, when we're distressed, we absolutely have to have external support, and we build it into our lives as best we can, right? And that external support for regulation, if we do it thoughtfully, if we're providing that as caregivers, which is exactly what you're doing, you are actually providing the container for connection, safety, and neural development through touch. If you're doing it thoughtfully, that actually can later in life become internalized. That's what you're doing. That's absolutely what you're doing. You're actually repatterning people's brains, and you can do it more and less well